The phone rings at 2:47 a.m. in a quiet suburban home in Charlotte, North Carolina. The woman who answers isn't prepared for what she's about to hear. Her son, who she sent away to a Christian boarding school to fix his behavioral problems, has just been found dead in his dormitory room. The official cause? Suicide. But what his mother would discover over the next 3 years would expose a web of abuse, cover-ups, and institutional corruption that reaches into the highest levels of American evangelical Christianity. This isn't an isolated incident. Behind the gleaming facades of megachurches, the inspiring rhetoric of televangelists, and the promise of spiritual salvation lies a darker truth that many institutions have fought desperately to hide. Money has been stolen, children have been abused, and when victims have tried to speak out, they've been silenced by armies of lawyers and non-disclosure agreements funded by weekly tithes from faithful congregants. The story begins in 1974 in a small town in Arkansas, where a charismatic young pastor named Tom Phillips started what would become one of the fastest-growing Christian organizations in America. Phillips had a vision: create residential facilities where troubled youth could find God and turn their lives around. He called it New Hope Ministries, and within a decade, he was operating 17 facilities across 12 states, housing over 3,000 teenagers at any given time. What happened inside those walls would remain hidden for nearly 40 years. Sarah Henderson was 14 when her parents sent her to New Hope's facility in rural Tennessee. She had been caught smoking marijuana twice, and her conservative Christian parents believed their daughter needed intensive spiritual intervention. The brochures showed smiling teenagers participating in Bible studies, working in gardens, and engaging in wholesome outdoor activities. The reality was startlingly different. Sarah's first night at New Hope, she was placed in what staff called the reflection room, a concrete cell with no windows, no bed, and a drain in the floor that served as a toilet. She would spend the next 72 hours in complete darkness, receiving only bread and water, while staff members took turns reading Bible verses through a slot in the door. When she finally emerged, she was told that this was God's way of breaking down her prideful spirit. This was just the beginning. Over the next 18 months, Sarah witnessed and experienced systematic psychological, physical, and sexual abuse perpetrated by staff members who claimed to be acting under divine authority. When children tried to run away, they were brought back by local police who had agreements with the facility. When they tried to call their parents, their phone privileges were revoked for months. When they reported abuse, they were told they were lying and subjected to even harsher discipline. And all of this was happening while New Hope Ministries was receiving millions of dollars in donations from churches and individuals who believed they were supporting a godly cause. Hey everyone, this is Professor Archive, and welcome back to the channel. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop a comment and let me know. Also, if you've been following the channel and enjoying these deep dives into hidden history, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps support the research that goes into these investigations. Now let's continue. The pattern of abuse at New Hope wasn't an accident, it was a business model. Tom Phillips had studied the techniques used in military training and cult indoctrination, adapting them for what he called spiritual warfare against adolescent rebellion. Every aspect of daily life was designed to break down a child's sense of individual identity and replace it with absolute obedience to authority. Children were forced to confess their sins in public sessions that could last for hours. These confessions were recorded and used as blackmail if anyone ever tried to speak out about their experiences. They were subjected to Satan purging ceremonies where they were held down while staff members screamed at supposed demons possessing them. Sleep deprivation was routine. Children were often awakened at 3 or 4 in the morning for emergency prayer sessions that were actually psychological torture designed to make them more compliant. The sexual abuse was systematic and widespread. Male staff members routinely entered girls' dormitories at night, claiming they were conducting spiritual wellness checks. Female staff members engaged in inappropriate relationships with teenage boys, telling them that physical intimacy was part of their healing process. When children became pregnant as a result of these encounters, they were either forced to have abortions in secret or give birth and surrender their babies for adoption through networks connected to the organization. But perhaps most disturbing was how the organization used religious language to normalize and justify the abuse. Staff members told children that their suffering was God's will, that they deserved punishment for their sins, and that reporting abuse would be an act of rebellion against divine authority. Many victims internalized these messages so deeply that it took them decades to recognize what had happened to them. Meanwhile, Tom Phillips was becoming a celebrity in evangelical circles. He appeared on Christian television programs, spoke at major conferences, and wrote books about youth ministry that were used in seminaries across the country. His organization was endorsed by prominent pastors and politicians who praised his tough love approach to dealing with troubled teenagers. The money was pouring in. By the 1990s, New Hope Ministries was generating over $50 million annually in revenue. Phillips used this money to build a sprawling compound in Arkansas that included a mansion for himself, a private airstrip, and a fleet of luxury vehicles. He claimed that his wealth was a blessing from God for his faithful service, and many supporters believed him. But the first cracks in the facade began to appear in 1998, when a former staff member named David Martinez contacted a local newspaper reporter with a shocking story. Martinez had worked at the Tennessee facility for 3 years before his conscience finally compelled him to speak out. He provided detailed accounts of the abuse he had witnessed, along with copies of internal documents that showed the organization's leadership was aware of the problems and actively covering them up. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh of the Nashville Tribune, spent 8 months investigating Martinez's claims. What she discovered was a systematic pattern of abuse across multiple facilities, involving hundreds of victims and dozens of perpetrators. She found evidence that local law enforcement agencies had been paid to ignore reports of abuse, that state officials had been bribed to overlook licensing violations, and that the organization had spent millions of dollars on legal fees to silence victims and witnesses. Walsh's investigation revealed that Tom Phillips himself had a history of sexual misconduct that dated back to his early days as a pastor. Multiple women had accused him of inappropriate behavior, but their complaints had been dismissed by church leadership as attempts to destroy a man of God. When these women persisted in their accusations, they were subjected to campaigns of harassment and intimidation that forced them to relocate and change their identities. The most shocking revelation came when Walsh obtained copies of internal communications between Phillips and other evangelical leaders. These documents showed that prominent pastors and Christian organizations had known about the abuse allegations for years but had chosen to protect Phillips rather than his victims. They had provided him with financial support, legal assistance, and public endorsements, even while being fully aware of the credible accusations against him. When Walsh's investigation was published as a series of articles in November 1998, the response from the evangelical community was swift and devastating, but not in the way victims had hoped. Instead of expressing outrage about the abuse, prominent Christian leaders rallied to defend Phillips and attack Walsh's credibility. They claimed that the investigation was part of a secular media conspiracy to destroy Christian ministries. They organized boycotts against the Nashville Tribune and its advertisers. They filed lawsuits alleging defamation and invasion of privacy. Most tragically, they launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the victims who had spoken to Walsh. These brave survivors were branded as liars, troublemakers, and agents of Satan who were trying to destroy God's work. Many received threatening phone calls and letters. Some were fired from their jobs when their employers were contacted by Phillips' supporters. Several were forced to enter witness protection programs after receiving credible death threats. The institutional response revealed something profoundly disturbing about how power operates within evangelical Christianity. The same communities that preached about moral absolutes, about the importance of protecting children, and about the necessity of accountability for sin, were willing to sacrifice abuse victims to protect powerful men and institutions. This pattern would repeat itself over and over again in the decades that followed, affecting everyone from local pastors to internationally known televangelists to the leaders of major Christian organizations. The mechanisms of cover-up became increasingly sophisticated, involving teams of lawyers, private investigators, public relations firms, and compliant media outlets that helped powerful figures escape consequences for their actions. Sarah Henderson, meanwhile, had spent years trying to rebuild her life after leaving New Hope. She struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and an inability to form healthy relationships. She had attempted suicide multiple times and had been hospitalized for self-harm behaviors that traced directly back to her experiences in the facility. When Sarah read Walsh's articles, she finally understood that what had happened to her wasn't her fault, and that she wasn't alone. She decided to contact the reporter and share her own story, becoming one of the first victims to speak publicly about her experiences at New Hope. The response was immediate and brutal. Within days of her interview being published, Sarah received hundreds of hostile messages from Phillips' supporters. They called her a liar, a whore, and a tool of Satan. They sent her graphic death threats and published her home address online. Someone threw a brick through her apartment window with a note that read, "God will punish false witnesses." But Sarah's courage inspired other victims to come forward. Over the next year, more than 200 former New Hope residents contacted Walsh with their own stories of abuse. Their accounts were remarkably consistent, describing a culture of systematic cruelty that had persisted for decades under the cover of Christian ministry. The legal battles that followed would stretch on for nearly a decade. Phillips and his organization had virtually unlimited resources to fight the allegations, funded by donations from supporters who believed they were defending Christianity itself against secular attack. The victims, meanwhile, were mostly working-class individuals who could barely afford legal representation. The organization's lawyers employed every possible tactic to avoid accountability. They challenged the statute of limitations, arguing that too much time had passed for the allegations to be prosecuted. They claimed religious freedom protections, arguing that secular courts had no authority to judge spiritual practices. They filed countersuits against victims and journalists, seeking millions of dollars in damages for defamation. Most effectively, they used the discovery process to intimidate and exhaust their opponents. Victims were forced to undergo depositions that lasted for days, during which they were subjected to humiliating questions about their personal lives and psychological histories. The lawyers painted these traumatized individuals as mentally unstable, morally compromised, and motivated by greed rather than justice. The strategy worked. Many victims dropped their lawsuits rather than endure years of legal torture. Others accepted small settlement amounts in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from speaking publicly about their experiences. The few cases that made it to trial were typically decided in favor of New Hope, as juries struggled to believe that such horrific abuse could occur in a Christian environment. By 2008, Tom Phillips appeared to have successfully weathered the crisis. Most of the lawsuits had been dismissed or settled quietly. Media attention had moved on to other stories. New Hope Ministries was still operating, still receiving donations, and still housing hundreds of teenagers in facilities across the country. But Phillips had made one critical mistake. In his arrogance, he had continued the same patterns of behavior that had gotten him in trouble in the first place. He was still sexually abusing children, still covering up misconduct by his staff, and still using religious authority to silence victims. And this time, the victim was someone who couldn't be intimidated, discredited, or silenced. Rebecca Martinez was the 16-year-old daughter of David Martinez, the same former staff member who had first blown the whistle on New Hope's abuses. After her father's revelations, the Martinez family had been subjected to years of harassment and threats from Phillips' supporters. Their home had been vandalized, their cars had been sabotaged, and they had been forced to move several times to escape the persecution. Despite everything her family had endured, Rebecca had maintained her Christian faith and wanted to work in ministry. When she turned 16, she applied for a summer internship with a Christian youth organization that she didn't realize was connected to Tom Phillips. The internship was supposed to involve administrative work and youth counseling in a supportive, faith-based environment. Instead, Rebecca found herself trapped in the same system of abuse that had destroyed so many lives before her. But unlike the previous victims, Rebecca had been warned by her father about what to watch for. She had been taught to recognize manipulation and grooming behaviors. Most importantly, she had been given a hidden recording device and instructions to document anything suspicious that happened. Over the course of 6 weeks, Rebecca secretly recorded hundreds of hours of audio that provided unprecedented insight into how the abuse system operated. She captured conversations in which staff members discussed their sexual relationships with minors, planned cover-ups of serious injuries, and laughed about the psychological damage they were inflicting on children. Most dramatically, she recorded Tom Phillips himself sexually assaulting her and two other teenage girls, while telling them that physical intimacy with him was a form of prayer that would bring them closer to God. The recordings were explicit, undeniable, and legally devastating. When David Martinez turned over his daughter's recordings to law enforcement in August 2008, the response was immediate. FBI agents raided New Hope facilities in 6 states simultaneously, seizing computers, financial records, and thousands of pages of internal documents. Within hours, Tom Phillips was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, child abuse, and racketeering. The criminal case that followed would finally expose the full scope of the corruption that had enabled decades of abuse. Federal prosecutors painted a picture of a criminal organization that had used religious faith as a cover for systematic exploitation of vulnerable children. They showed how Phillips and his associates had bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and used charitable donations to fund lavish lifestyles while children under their care suffered unthinkable abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to Rebecca's recordings, investigators had recovered computer files showing that Phillips had maintained detailed records of his sexual encounters with minors, apparently as some sort of twisted trophy collection. They found financial records showing that millions of dollars in donations had been diverted to pay for cover-ups, bribes, and personal expenses. They discovered communication networks that Phillips had used to share images and videos of child abuse with other predators in Christian ministry. Perhaps most disturbing, they uncovered evidence of a broader conspiracy involving dozens of other evangelical leaders who had knowingly protected Phillips and participated in covering up his crimes. The investigation revealed that sexual abuse within Christian organizations was far more widespread than anyone had previously imagined, and that there was an informal network of powerful figures who helped each other escape accountability. When Tom Phillips finally went to trial in 2010, the courtroom was packed with victims who had waited decades for this moment. Many of them had never expected to see their abuser face legal consequences, and some had spent years believing that they would never be believed or vindicated. Sarah Henderson was among those who testified. Now in her 40s, she spoke calmly and clearly about the abuse she had suffered as a teenager, the impact it had on her life, and her long journey toward healing and recovery. She looked directly at Phillips as she spoke, refusing to be intimidated by the man who had once held such power over her. The defense team's strategy was predictable but shocking in its audacity. They argued that Phillips was being persecuted for his Christian beliefs by a secular legal system that wanted to destroy religious freedom. They claimed that his relationships with teenage girls had been consensual and spiritual in nature. They suggested that the victims were lying or mistaken about what had happened to them. The jury saw through these tactics immediately. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Phillips was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, ensuring that he would likely die behind bars. But the criminal conviction was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning within evangelical Christianity. The evidence that had emerged during the trial implicated dozens of other leaders and organizations in similar patterns of abuse and cover-up. Victims who had been silenced for years suddenly found their voices, and the carefully constructed walls of secrecy began to crumble. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in America, was forced to acknowledge that it had systematically covered up sexual abuse cases for decades. Internal documents revealed that denominational leaders had maintained a secret list of accused predators but had failed to warn churches or law enforcement about these individuals. Many of these accused abusers had simply moved from church to church, leaving trails of victims wherever they went. Hillsong Church, an influential megachurch with locations around the world, faced multiple scandals involving financial corruption and sexual misconduct by its leadership. Carl Lentz, the charismatic pastor who had built the church's New York location into a celebrity hotspot, was fired for moral failures that included multiple affairs and misuse of church funds. Liberty University, one of America's largest Christian colleges, saw its president Jerry Falwell Jr. resign in disgrace after revelations about his involvement in unusual sexual arrangements and his wife's affair with a business partner. The scandal exposed a culture of hypocrisy at the highest levels of the university, where students were held to strict moral codes while leadership engaged in behavior that violated their own stated principles. Ravi Zacharias, an internationally renowned Christian apologist who had spent decades defending the intellectual credibility of Christianity, died in 2020 shortly before investigations revealed that he had sexually abused numerous women over the course of his career. The organization that bore his name was forced to acknowledge that Zacharias had used his position of spiritual authority to manipulate and exploit vulnerable women, often using religious language to justify his behavior. Each of these scandals followed remarkably similar patterns. Powerful men used their religious authority to silence victims and avoid accountability. Organizations prioritized protecting their reputations over protecting vulnerable people. When allegations emerged, armies of lawyers and PR specialists were deployed to discredit accusers and minimize damage. Supporters were mobilized to attack anyone who challenged the narrative of innocence. The financial dimensions of these cover-ups were staggering. The Catholic Church has paid out over $4 billion in settlements related to sexual abuse cases, but that figure only scratches the surface of the total cost. When you include the money spent on legal fees, private investigators, counseling for perpetrators, relocating accused priests, and public relations campaigns, the true cost rises to tens of billions of dollars. All of this money came from the donations of faithful Catholics who believed they were supporting God's work. Protestant organizations have been less transparent about their financial settlements, often requiring victims to sign non-disclosure agreements as a condition of receiving compensation. But conservative estimates suggest that evangelical organizations have spent well over $1 billion on abuse-related costs over the past 2 decades. These massive expenditures reveal something important about institutional priorities. Organizations that claim to be driven by spiritual rather than financial motives were willing to spend vast sums of money to protect themselves from accountability. They deployed resources that could have fed the hungry, housed the homeless, or supported genuine ministry work, instead using that money to silence victims and protect predators. The psychological impact on victims has been immeasurable. Many survivors of religious abuse struggle with complex trauma that combines the typical effects of sexual assault with the spiritual manipulation that was used to justify their victimization. They often lose their faith entirely or struggle with deep confusion about the nature of God and religious authority. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist who specializes in religious trauma, explains that victims of clerical abuse face unique challenges in their recovery. When someone uses God's name to hurt you, she says, it creates a wound that goes much deeper than physical or emotional abuse alone. It attacks the victim's entire framework for understanding morality, authority, and the nature of good and evil. Many survivors report feeling abandoned, not just by their abusers, but by God Himself. They struggle with questions about whether their faith was ever real, whether they somehow deserved what happened to them, and whether there is any such thing as genuine spiritual authority. These spiritual wounds often persist long after the physical and emotional trauma has been addressed. The institutional response to these crises has been mixed at best. Some organizations have implemented meaningful reforms, including mandatory background checks, abuse reporting protocols, and independent oversight mechanisms. Others have made cosmetic changes while preserving the fundamental power structures that enabled abuse in the first place. The most progressive reforms have come from organizations that have been forced to change by legal pressure or public scrutiny. The least reform has occurred in groups that have managed to avoid accountability through legal maneuvering or successful public relations campaigns. One of the most significant barriers to reform has been the doctrine of pastoral authority that pervades much of evangelical Christianity. This teaching holds that pastors and other church leaders are appointed by God and should be obeyed without question. Challenging leadership is often characterized as rebellion against divine authority, which creates a culture where abuse can flourish unchecked. Many evangelical communities also maintain beliefs about gender roles that make them particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse scandals. Women are often taught to be submissive to male authority and to bear responsibility for men's sexual behavior. These teachings create environments where male leaders face little accountability for sexual misconduct, while female victims are blamed for tempting righteous men into sin. The emphasis on forgiveness within Christian culture has also been weaponized to protect abusers. Victims are often pressured to forgive their attackers quickly and completely, without requiring accountability or changed behavior. This distortion of genuine forgiveness allows predators to escape consequences, while their victims are shamed for seeking justice. Perhaps most troubling has been the response of rank-and-file believers to these scandals. While some have demanded accountability and reform, many others have rallied to defend accused leaders and attack their accusers. Social media has amplified these dynamics, creating echo chambers where supporters can convince themselves that any allegation against their spiritual heroes must be false. The case of Josh Duggar illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Duggar rose to fame as part of the reality TV show 19 Kids and Counting, which portrayed his family as models of Christian virtue. When it was revealed that Duggar had sexually abused several of his younger sisters as a teenager, many supporters rushed to defend him, arguing that he had been forgiven by God and deserved a second chance. When Duggar was later arrested for possession of child sexual abuse material, some supporters still refused to abandon him. They constructed elaborate conspiracy theories about how he was being framed by enemies of Christianity. They raised money for his legal defense and continued to portray him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. This pattern of victim blaming and perpetrator protecting reveals something deeply disturbing about how power and authority function within many religious communities. The same people who claim to follow a savior who championed the oppressed and vulnerable often end up protecting the powerful and wealthy at the expense of the weak and marginalized. The financial incentives that drive modern religious institutions also contribute to these problems. Megachurches, televangelism empires, and large denominational organizations depend on continuous cash flow to maintain their operations. Scandals threaten this income stream, creating powerful incentives to suppress negative information and maintain positive public images at all costs. Many religious leaders have become celebrities whose personal brands are worth millions of dollars. They write best-selling books, command high speaking fees, and build media empires around their personalities. When abuse allegations emerge, these leaders have enormous financial motivation to fight back rather than accept accountability. The tax-exempt status of religious organizations also complicates oversight and accountability. Churches and ministries face much less financial scrutiny than secular nonprofits, making it easier for them to misuse funds and hide questionable expenditures. When abuse scandals emerge, these organizations can often use their vast resources to outlast and overwhelm their accusers. The international scope of many evangelical organizations creates additional challenges for accountability. When scandals break in one country, leaders can simply relocate to places where they face less scrutiny. Several prominent American pastors who faced abuse allegations have moved their operations to countries in Africa and Asia, where they continue to operate with minimal oversight. The rise of independent charismatic movements has made these problems even worse. Unlike traditional denominations that have established hierarchies and accountability structures, many modern evangelical organizations operate with minimal oversight. Charismatic leaders can start churches or ministries with virtually no training, credentials, or supervision, creating ideal conditions for abuse and exploitation. The internet has both helped and hindered efforts to address these problems. On one hand, social media platforms have given victims new ways to share their stories and connect with other survivors. Online activism has exposed many scandals that might otherwise have remained hidden. On the other hand, the internet has also enabled the spread of conspiracy theories and disinformation that protect abusers and attack victims. The Counter Me Too and Counting Church Too movements have created new momentum for accountability within religious institutions. Survivors who had been silenced for decades have found their voices, and the cumulative weight of their testimonies has become impossible to ignore. These movements have also connected religious abuse survivors with the broader movement for gender justice, providing them with new resources and support networks. However, many religious communities have proven remarkably resistant to the changes that these movements demand. They have created alternative narratives that portray accountability efforts as attacks on faith itself. They have developed sophisticated messaging strategies that allow them to appear sympathetic to victims while continuing to protect perpetrators. The legal system has also struggled to address religious abuse effectively. Statutes of limitations have prevented many cases from being prosecuted, even when credible evidence exists. Religious freedom protections have been used to shield organizations from oversight and accountability. The high burden of proof required in criminal cases means that many abusers escape conviction even when their behavior is widely known. Civil litigation has been more successful in some cases, but religious organizations often have resources that far exceed anything available to individual victims. They can afford teams of expensive lawyers, private investigators, and expert witnesses that most survivors could never match. Many victims settle their cases not because they receive adequate compensation, but because they simply can't afford to continue fighting. The statute of limitations has been a particular barrier to justice. Most sexual abuse occurs when victims are children or young adults who lack the power, resources, or understanding to seek legal recourse immediately. By the time many survivors are ready to pursue justice, too much time has passed under traditional legal frameworks. Some states have begun to reform their laws to address these problems. They have extended or eliminated statutes of limitations for child sexual abuse cases. They have created special windows of time during which old cases can be refiled. They have reduced the burden of proof required in cases involving religious institutions. But progress has been uneven, and many survivors still find themselves legally barred from seeking justice against their abusers. Religious organizations have often lobbied against these legal reforms, arguing that they would create unfair financial burdens and threaten religious freedom. The international dimensions of these problems require new approaches to accountability and oversight. When American religious leaders move their operations overseas to escape scrutiny, they often target vulnerable populations in developing countries who have even fewer resources to protect themselves. Several organizations have been created to track these international movements and warn potential victims about dangerous religious leaders. But their resources are limited, and they face significant challenges in gathering information and communicating warnings across cultural and linguistic barriers. The psychological and spiritual recovery of abuse survivors requires specialized approaches that most mental health professionals are not equipped to provide. Religious trauma has its own unique characteristics that differ from other forms of abuse and exploitation. Survivors often need help not just in processing their traumatic experiences, but in rebuilding their entire framework for understanding spirituality, authority, and moral truth. Some survivors have found healing by leaving religion entirely and building secular worldviews that don't depend on spiritual authority figures. Others have found new forms of faith that emphasize personal relationship with the divine rather than institutional mediation. Still, others have worked to reform the religious communities they come from, becoming advocates for change from within. The children of abuse survivors face their own unique challenges. Many grow up with parents who have been deeply wounded by religious institutions, creating complex family dynamics around questions of faith and trust. Some reject religion entirely based on their parents' experiences, while others embrace faith as a way of rebelling against their parents' pain. The broader cultural impact of these scandals has been significant. Public trust in religious institutions has declined dramatically over the past 2 decades, particularly among younger generations who have grown up hearing about these scandals. Many people who might have found meaning and community in religious contexts have been driven away by the hypocrisy and abuse they've witnessed. This crisis of trust has created opportunities for genuine reform, but it has also enabled cynical leaders who exploit people's disillusionment for their own gain. Some of the most dangerous religious leaders today are those who position themselves as alternatives to corrupt traditional institutions while engaging in the same exploitative behaviors. The financial costs of abuse scandals continue to mount, and some religious organizations are facing genuine threats to their survival. The Catholic Church has been forced to sell property, close schools, and cut programs to pay for abuse settlements. Some evangelical organizations have filed for bankruptcy rather than face the financial consequences of their crimes. These financial pressures have created new incentives for reform, but they have also led some organizations to double down on secrecy and denial. The more money an organization stands to lose from abuse revelations, the more aggressively they often fight to suppress those revelations. Looking toward the future, several trends seem likely to continue. More survivors will find their voices and share their stories, particularly as social media platforms make it easier to connect with other victims and supportive communities. Legal reforms will continue to expand opportunities for accountability, though progress will be uneven across different jurisdictions. The generational transition within religious leadership will also be crucial. Younger religious leaders who have grown up with awareness of these scandals may be more committed to transparency and accountability than their predecessors. But they will also inherit institutions and cultures that have been shaped by decades of secrecy and abuse. The role of technology in both enabling and preventing abuse will continue to evolve. Digital communication creates new opportunities for grooming and exploitation, but it also creates evidence trails that make it harder for abusers to escape accountability. Artificial intelligence and data analysis tools may make it possible to identify patterns of abuse more quickly and effectively than ever before. The international dimensions of religious abuse will require new forms of cooperation between law enforcement agencies, advocacy organizations, and religious communities across national boundaries. As religious organizations become increasingly global in their reach, accountability efforts must also become more internationally coordinated. The story of Sarah Henderson, the young woman we met at the beginning of this investigation, has a complex ending. After years of therapy and legal battles, she has found a measure of peace and healing. She now works as an advocate for other survivors, helping them navigate the legal system and find resources for recovery. But Sarah's healing came at enormous cost, both to herself and to her family. She lost decades of her life to trauma and recovery. She was never able to have children, due in part to physical injuries she suffered during her time at New Hope. She struggles with chronic health problems that trace back to the stress and abuse she endured as a teenager. Sarah often wonders what her life might have been like if she had never been sent to that facility, or if someone had intervened to stop the abuse when it was happening. But she doesn't dwell in bitterness or regret. Instead, she has channeled her pain into purpose, working to ensure that other children don't have to suffer as she did. The broader question that emerges from these stories is whether genuine reform is possible within institutions that have been so deeply corrupted by abuse and cover-up. Some argue that the problem is too systemic and too deeply rooted to be fixed through incremental change. They believe that only completely new forms of religious community, with radically different power structures and accountability mechanisms, can avoid repeating these patterns. Others maintain that existing institutions can be reformed if enough pressure is applied, and if genuine leaders emerge who are committed to change. They point to examples of organizations that have implemented meaningful reforms, and argue that transformation is possible with sufficient will and resources. What seems clear is that the old models of religious authority, which concentrated enormous power in the hands of individual leaders with minimal oversight or accountability, are no longer sustainable. The digital age has made secrecy much more difficult to maintain, and cultural shifts have made people less willing to defer automatically to religious authority figures. The survivors who have found the courage to speak out against abuse and institutional cover-up have performed an invaluable service, not just for other potential victims, but for religious communities themselves. By forcing these institutions to confront their failures and blind spots, they have created opportunities for genuine spiritual renewal and reform. The cost of this accountability has been enormous. Brave individuals have sacrificed their privacy, their safety, and often their relationships with family and community to expose these truths. Many have faced years of litigation, harassment, and character assassination. Some have never recovered from the trauma of both the original abuse and the institutional response to their allegations. But their courage has also created new possibilities. Religious communities that embrace accountability and transparency may be able to rebuild trust and create genuinely safe spaces for spiritual growth and community building. Organizations that continue to prioritize self-protection over victim care will likely face continued decline and eventual collapse.